So we've talked about the philosophical basis for international law, and we've talked a little bit about the development of international law and international legal principles. And now we move into the idea of the modern trend in thinking about international law. Now, international law, in many ways, one could argue that it was an integral part of the violence that erupted as a result of World War I. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you probably never wondered, what were the causes of World War I? What was the cause of the war? Why were so many countries involved in this war? And that's a hard question, and in fact, it's a hard question now, and it was a hard question at the time. So how did it arise? Well, it arose because during the 19th century, a number of states had entered into military defense treaties. So many of you know that the spark that set off World War I, the original impetus was the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by an ethnic Serb in Serbia. That's started it out. So Austria goes to war with Serbia over this assassination. Russia has a treaty with Serbia, and so therefore Russia is drawn into the war. And it cascades from there. Russia has an agreement with England and France, which brings them into the war. Then Germany enters the war. Germany invades France by going through Belgium, and so now Belgium enters the war, and eventually even Japan, who has a treaty with England, will enter into the war. And finally, the United States shows up during the last year of the war. And so, in many ways, you could look at World War I as being caused by this idea of treaties and agreements, positive law. Now, these ideas of positive law were not abandoned after the war. And in fact, we can see that in the idea of the League of Nations, a group of countries that are trying to substitute international authority for the use of force, to put in some body, not a sovereign body, but a body in which the states have agreed to follow as a representative authority. And of course, as you probably are aware, the League of Nations was ultimately doomed, in large part because the United States refused to join. The United States went through a period of isolation after World War I. However, it did do some very important things, and probably the most important is what we now know as the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention, a convention is a large-scale treaty, and what this did was it essentially formulated rules about how parties should interact in a war, how countries should engage in a war. And so we saw things like poison gas outlawed. Poison gas was a feature of World War I, and what the Geneva Convention said is like, it's okay to go to war, but don't engage in the use of poison gas. And so the Geneva Convention also provided for the treatment of prisoners of war, and this will come in very importantly during World War II, obviously. So these treaties limited the right of a state to pursue war as an instrument of policy, as something that they intend to use to accomplish a societal goal. Now, of course, the League of Nations failed, and the peace that erupted after the war quickly ended, and we ended up in another world war. And after World War II, international law saw three major developments. And the first was the idea that international organizations, there have been an explosion of international organizations created following World War II. And so what that meant was that international law had to expand to cover not just the interactions between states, but the interactions between international organizations with one another and international organizations with states. What else did we see after World War II? Well, we saw many more non-Western states joining the family of nations. The decolonization era, which had begun at the end of the 19th century, accelerated through the first part of the 20th century. And so we see many more non-Western states who are coming to join the idea of nations. And we also saw a gap develop between developed countries and lesser developed countries, which created a demand for a new economic order. The idea that we have to create a framework to allow countries to trade with one another because that's going to be necessary for international legal purposes. The Cold War, which started immediately after World War II, also played a role in the development of international law. Now, the Cold War, I say it was fought in two stages. There was no active military interaction called the Cold War. However, there were these two phases of the Cold War. The Cold War starting almost immediately after World War II, 1947, and continuing up through the end of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Now, the first phase of the Cold War, from 1947 to 1980, we could refer to that as the containment era. Now, the Cold War was about this idea that there was a colossal conflict between Western ideas of capitalism and Eastern ideas of socialism and communism. And therefore, in this first phase of the Cold War, the focus was on containing communism, containing that brand of socialism to those countries that already had it, but not allowing other countries to become communist. And we attempted to create this environment to contain communism, in large part through the use of international law. So when you have a situation like the war in Korea, the police action, the war in Korea was actually an action not by the United States, but by the United Nations. Now, it was certainly aimed at containing communism, but it did so through the context of international law. We have agreed as the United Nations to go to war to prevent this, the takeover of South Korea. Now, the second phase of the Cold War, we can call that the subversion era. And this is really starting in 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was an anti-communist from way back. And during this era, the focus became not let's interact with international law to contain communism. Instead, it was let's subvert communism by whatever means necessary, which means if it is outside the concept of international law, well, that's okay. So one of the key things that occurred during the 80s, one of the big scandals of the 1980s was what called the Iran-Contra affair. And the Iran-Contra affair, at its heart, was based on the idea that the government, the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government, what they did was they entered into secret treaties with Iran to sell them weapons. And then they took the money from, which was against the law. The Congress had passed a law prohibiting trade with Iran following the Iranian hostage crisis. But the idea was we're going to secretly sell them weapons, and then we're going to take that money, and then we're going to use it to support rebels in Nicaragua, which was at the time had elected a communist government. And so we supported what were called the Contras, the Contra revolutionaries, the people against the government. And it was completely outside the bounds of international law and violated certain principles that said you should not invade another country without a good reason for it. But nevertheless, we as a society decided this was okay because we are about subverting communism through whatever means necessary, meaning in the bounds of international law, but also outside the bounds of international law.